talk and be charming.
Okay.
No, too much
Life
pressure
means
now.
dead.
We clam right up.
Life means dead.
Oh man.
Okay, let's see. Are we live? It feels like we're live.
Yeah, I feel
It
different.
looks like we're live, at least on YouTube and Facebook. So
We live.
they're live. Happy Genrethon, everyone. As I said this morning, I'm Katie Rupert. I am your host and curator for this weekend, and I'm here with some of the cast of Improvised Star Trek: Nick Wagner, Mary Cait Walthall, and Dan Granata. How are you guys?
Good.
So good. Thank you for having us.
So good to see you. Last time I believe I saw all of you was at the episode of your final podcast.
Yes, right. Yeah.
That was such a great episode. 4 weddings and another wedding.
4 weddings and another wedding, and that was when was that? November that we did that? Yeah,
it might have been November.
Yeah,
that was
when
7
people
years
could all
ago.
be together.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's wild that we're all just streaming from different parts of the same house right now. No, we're all very far apart, but it's good to be together again, especially after last year. A big highlight of the festival was your guys' last live performance, which was at Otherworld. That was also a huge honor. So it's so good to see you guys again. I have some questions. Oh, go ahead, Nick.
It also happened to be our 100th live show of all time,
That's
including going all the way back to the humble beginnings at IO Theater. So
and we planned it.
For 9 years out, we're just like
JJ Abrams helped us plan that out. Like he always plans everything out so well.
Big storyboard and the red
and just nails it. Just nails it every time.
Right. Stuck that landing.
I love it. I have some questions from you. Some of them are from our friends in the Great White Internet. Some of them are just from me. So I'm not going to force you guys to answer too many questions, but I do have a few. So you guys did this show for 10 years. And like that is like almost like a little like big moment in comedy. And I have a question, and it's, you know, in that 10 years, how did improv stylistically and logistically change while you were doing it? And obviously you guys went through a big genesis where you were at IO doing live shows and kind of moved more into digital and podcasting. So I'm really curious to see what your guys' answer is on this.
Yeah, it went through a lot because when we started, podcasts were barely a thing.
Right.
When we started the live show. And I was interested in kind of morphing the show into a podcast because I grew up listening to audio comedy, various different kind of audio comedy shows, including like narrative ones, and I just thought there was always this comedy potential, and the alignment with improv that I see is that when you're doing improv in a room, you're asking the audience to participate in the creation of the thing that you're making. So when you establish that, I'm holding a candlestick or whatever, you need the audience to help you create that. And in the same way, when you do something via audio, you're really asking the audience to create a lot of that themselves in their mind. And that's why I think it works to start to kind of take an improv show and do it via audio in both forms. As soon as you say, I've been naked this whole time, well, you've been naked this whole time, and the audience is forced to kind of reevaluate everything that has happened up until now, and that character has been naked that whole time. And you can do that in both improv and audio, but you can't do that with a regular stage show, with costumes and such.
Right.
You just can't retroactively make things different. So that's my answer to the beginning part of that question in terms of like how our show changed. What do you guys have to say about it?
Man, I mean, I find it hard to speak for, all of improv and how it's changed, but having been in Chicago during that time, just the theaters, all like the three major theaters all expanding significantly, I think changed the landscape in terms of I'm sort of chicken and egg situation, but just the numbers of people is really exploded and had been already growing. And then just seeing the rise and fall of a lot of small theaters, and then also just the rise of the new small theaters, that has been really exciting. It seems like there's a lot of different possibilities within improv. But yeah, I'd say the audio improv space has been like, I've felt really lucky to have joined into Improvised Star Trek when it was already a podcast and already this incredible project where, just like Nick said, like I'm always, when I teach improv, I do talk to my students about how the audience is improvising along with you. Their minds are just as much engaged in creating the show, even in live improv. And the podcast format, I think, just makes such good use of that. I'd say almost better than in-person improv, using the audience's minds.
That's really cool.
I think that, man, a couple of responses to see if I remember all of them by the time I get through one of them. One thing is that I think about now, like reflecting back on it, like Nick and I met, like I came to IST via Nick, and Nick and I met. My first awareness of Nick as a person, it is impossible that we hadn't met before this, but my first memory of Nick was during an improv scene at that we were both in a class at IO. So I didn't just come to consciousness there. We had talked before, but I don't remember any of it. It was suddenly when I was like, oh, hey, this is fun. But it's funny that by the time Nick started getting involved in IST, I was so burnt out on improv. I was just like, I felt like I was over it. I had seen it. I felt like I was just done with it. And it didn't like being around it. It just created a lot of anxieties and a lot of bad memories and just things. And I don't think that that's uncommon for people. But what is uncommon is like finding your love again. Like, and that is the thing that I thought was really special about IST, is that, and this sort of gets to Mary Kate's comment, which is that like a weird thing happened as improv expanded from like the early aughts, 90, 99, the early aughts of IO and that sort of model of, it's not Second City where like the improv is kind of in service of writing sketch. It's improv, long form improv for improv's sake. And I think the community was small enough at the beginning that it was a different dynamic. But then by the time we all sort of like, well, it's like Nick and my cohort, which sort of mid 2005, 2006, 2007, it had gotten big enough that it was kind of becoming a bit of a machine. Those are my words. And so you would have this thing where like, and I've seen in the closing of IO, lots of people sort of comment on the fact that you're like, yeah, you would go and you would audition to be put together with a group of people who you're like, you're friends now. And because improv, like you're supposed to be a group that was creating organically, but the way those groups were composed was super inorganic for like most Herald teams. It was imposed by a group of people who I had never met, saying you'll all work well together. And then and there's something nice to that. But what was really cool about IST is that it did grow organically, and it grew out of a common love. And Star Trek people are kind of like, if you like Star Trek, you're kind of a band of humanity. Like the parameters for people who really like Star Trek, you kind of have some core values that translate really well. And I think that really helped, that plus improv meant that the people who were coming together to say, yeah, we're going to do funny make-em-ups in the context of Star Trek, meant that it was already self-selecting down to a very compatible core group of people. And it made it a joyful process, and it made it something that you could do for 10 years and made you want to come back. And then I think that what was really elevating for me, sort of getting back to the first thing that Nick said, I did remember all three things. The first thing that Nick said was about how the group changed. I remember the first time that I saw an IST show, and it was still, I felt like the jokes were still very much in the realm of, what if I said this crass thing in the context of doing of a Starfleet vessel? Like, well, isn't that funny? And that's funny for a little while, but it's not enough to sustain 10 years and 100 episodes worth of live shows and 200 some, podcasts. And what I think was really great by sort of the time I came on as like a cast crew member, and certainly by the time we hit our stride, was everybody was really focused on telling a good story and using the Star Trek framework of making sure you're hitting all the story beats and telling a complete story, which is not, I don't see that in a lot of long form improv. A lot of times people are just,
I think it's the most important thing. I think long forms that don't tell stories don't survive.
Exactly. And that having that framework, in addition to having the sort of the common love and the common humanity, like that allowed us to do more things and push ourselves further. And I think that put us in a different category, even aside from doing genre improv, that put us in a different category than a lot of other things. And it certainly kept me interested long past the point when I was going to see 10 p.m. shows at IO. I would still wanted to show up at 10 a.m. on a Sunday to do an IST recording.
Right. Well, your answer has inspired me to throw my order of questions out the window. So I think that there's really two things that make Improvised Star Trek like so watchable, like even now that it's over. And one is like your form, because when you listen to it, it doesn't feel like a long form. It feels like a sitcom. It's got A plot, it's got B plot, it has 3 acts every time. And like that is absolutely what gets me personally excited every time I watch it. And then the second thing is like the characters. Because like they're so dynamic and so interesting, and like even though they're like super silly, like they're interesting to like watch, especially like as you guys like grew and continued to perform, so did the characters. So I guess my next question is that like, how did this form develop? Were you part of the development process, or by the time you walked in had it already become a thing? Did it start off as a herald? Like where did this super unique, super formulaic, but like incredibly successful form come from?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start again, because of the three of us here, I'm the most senior, but even I wasn't there at the very beginning. Where at the very beginning of the stage show, they kind of workshopped, and basically they were working with the archetypes of Star Trek characters and roles, more like, by that point we'd had enough Star Trek series to know that the first officer doesn't have to be Spock, but there has to be a first officer, and there has to be a doctor, and there has to be an engineer. And then laid on top of those are various different kind of character type archetypes. There's the alien, and there's the one who doesn't, an alien who maybe doesn't understand humans, and maybe there's a non-human who really wants to be human. And there's the cantankerous one, and there's the gung-ho Captain Kirk type. And basically everyone worked with fitting those different roles and those different archetypes together. And came up with some obviously very funny combinations thereof, including the original doctor on the ship, Dr. Foggy McCloud, who was a gas cloud, a non-corporeal gas cloud being who didn't understand humans, not only didn't understand humans, but didn't understand the concept of having a body. And he's the doctor. So pretty funny. So that's how it all got kind of started. And then, yeah, it was very much like mapped onto the format of how does Star Trek work? Well, Star Trek has an A plot and a B plot, and they may be thematically related, but maybe not plot-wise related. And kind of exploring that dynamic, but that maps really well onto a Herald, where you have at least 2, if not 3 different kind of plot threads going on that may be thematically related and may come together in the end. And then we adapted that when we moved to the podcast format. Basically, we just shrunk it down. Like when we were doing live shows that were 45 minutes, and we started doing 45-minute podcast episodes, and they were a real drag. And we were just like, let's do it in 20 minutes. And we did our first 20-minute episode, and it was cooking. And we're like, okay, well, that's the difference. We'll just do it faster.
Yeah. Dan, do you want to go just to switch up the order?
Yeah, no, you were sensitive to that too. I was like, oh, I don't want to do it again. I mean, I think the thing that I would say that my thoughts on this are like, it's never easy. It was never comfortable, and it was a conscious effort. Like we would do, because I mean, it's improv. You sort of like what's going to come out tonight, and we would come. There were shows would come after and be like, yeah, that never really came together as a story. Like you would get halfway into a show and you're like, we've just been coasting by on like this one visual gag for a while, and like no one knows what the story is about. And I would say, as is usual, I would say that everybody had their sort of go-to thing, that they would do more often than not. And it was fun because for a long time, I was like in a booth before we figured out how to do stuff from the stage. And so I got to like watch as a spectator a lot. So I would just sit there thinking about like what everybody's doing. And you would see the way that certain people would respond or certain people would play. And I could see people like trying to slot in, like, I'm going to be the B story this time. I could see Chris Ratchet, who I've known, almost as long as I've known Nick, by like of a week or two, that like, I could see when Chris is like, yeah, I'm not going to be in this one. Like I could see him making that decision. And I'm like, okay, well, that's going to be interesting. He's like, I'm just here to do the bits tonight. And he would just relax and have fun with it. Matt Young, my favorite thing was always watching when Matt Young would decide in the opening credits scene at some point, whether or not he was like, this needs a goddamn structure. And so there would be shows where he would just walk on stage and be like, red alert, okay, Matt's deciding he's going to establish the plot up front. Or there would be times in those like opening, the cold open type scenes where Matt would decide, like, he'd be like, screw it, someone's calling in, and like, and just to establish some sort of plot structure, which Matt does on Magic Tavern all the time. So
right.
That's a real Matt thing. But one of the things that I know, Nick, I was wondering if you're remembering any specific times, like when we would switch between long periods of podcast recording and then doing live shows. Like there was a long stretch where we didn't do live shows, and then we went back to live shows. And it was a bit like the you could see that people were having a hard time switching their brains between like, hey, we've got to do more physical stuff to make this interesting, or you can't rely on the edits afterwards. You got, I'm wondering what, or Mary Kate, like what the feeling was from the inside of making those shifts, because I didn't really do the podcast all that often.
Yeah, you want to take that one, Mary Kate?
Sure. I guess for me, from the inside, making those shifts, I mean, it just is a totally different thing. Like the way we even warm up, every part of the process is different. And so for me, there was something about like my whole mind body would just kind of like switch into something else. And also having audience there and live responsiveness, like there's such a boost of energy. So whereas on a podcast recording day, we might record a full episode that's just super low energy, and we don't end up editing and releasing that one. That pretty much never happened at a live show in terms of energy level being the thing that killed us. And even if we felt like we didn't understand the plot so much, there was still like a good feeling in the room sometimes, like just from people being excited to interact with this fandom. So I think that was always, but also the best part to me of the live shows was the live tech. So that was always like just such an exciting boost to have someone playing along with us and to feel immersed in the world. Whereas in the podcast recordings, we're just talking to each other without the music, or we're making sound effects or going door instead of hearing the sound effects. Yeah. I just wanted to add, like, structurally, I think we've intuitively found a lot. There's a lot about rhythm that people get from watching the source material and from just practice and being able to trust each other, like follow the rhythm of the group. And when someone's coming in with something, just be like, yes. And I never felt like we were thinking about the form. By the time I was there, I was never thinking about the form. I was like, make up a character and then come play. And it was, to me, more intuitive by that point.
Can I ask a follow-up question of Mary Kate?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'll just switch. So now Dan is doing the interview and I'll answer questions.
No, I don't. It's funny that I've never thought to answer this question or ask this question before, but like I can't ask Nick because Nick's an editor. And I've never, and I haven't been a regular cast member that does the podcast. Have you, I'm wondering if listening to edited improv that you've done has fed back into the improv that you do.
In Improvised Star Trek?
Yeah, or just like hearing, because you know what you improvise, but then you're hearing and the edited version, which is hilarious. And like if there were any discoveries from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Listening to the edited version was always like, oh. First of all, it was such a boost of confidence. I mean, I think the way that it fed back into my improv was to be like, for me to think I'm better at improv than I actually am. Man, my sense of timing is great. Like that was one thing. But then also, I didn't always remember everything that we had done from the improvised ones. And there are also so many that we improvised and didn't edit. And then, so I would have like plot lines that didn't exist in the universe in my head. So listening to the actual podcast, I was just like, well, I got to stay up to date on Improvised Star Trek so I know where we are in the plot line.
My total abandonment of my questionnaire, hearing that was so interesting to me that you guys have episodes you never released. And like, obviously I know that because this week Nick gave us an episode to use for Genrethon. But I think that there's this thing kind of in improv that it's like, oh, if you do it, it's perfect. And it's so interesting to me that you guys held content back. Like that to me is like the sign of like a major professional operation but like what makes you hold content back?
Well, I should say before Nick answers that was not an easy choice because Nick and I were living together and Chris was a frequent, drop in while they were starting the beginning of the editing process. And I felt like there was a real pressure to be like, we've got to put out more content more frequently. So we've got to use everything. And then there came a point where we're like, well, we don't have to. We should probably do good things. It was a discussion.
Yeah. And there's some discussion, or there was some discussion, and has always been a kind of conversation in terms of like, what do we owe to the purity of the art form? How much can we edit and still call it improvised? And some of the editing has been fairly heavy over the years, depending on what the episode needed. But there have definitely been a few episodes throughout the years where we would take out kind of fairly major chunks of the episode because they were unnecessary, or it was just a C storyline that didn't go anywhere and also didn't have any jokes. And it's like, well, why are we spending 10 minutes of this episode on this thing that's not funny and not important? Like, and when it's improv, it's just.
It's improv. Yeah.
But do we have to? Do we have to let that out, or what if we just kept the 2/3 of that episode that was great? And that was ultimately our approach to the whole thing. Is like the easiest part for us in many ways was sitting down and improvising for 20 minutes.
Right.
So the kind of approach that we ultimately decided to take was, well, let's do that more and produce less, and we'll just take the best ones. And I would say that we probably ended up producing maybe a third of the episodes.
Wow.
Certainly during the kind of core years of the podcast, we would end up recording maybe 3 times a month, and we would record 2 episodes each time we got together, and then we would produce. So we would record 6 episodes a month, and we would produce 2 episodes a month, because we would produce every other week. So yeah, so basically, and that was in service of, I mean, I'm a perfectionist, and a lot of us, we just wanted to have our best work out there. Yeah. And, improv's fun and it's great. And I love it as an art form, but I don't think that everything is automatically gold. I think there's a lot of,
it's a tool.
It's a tool, and there's a lot of chaff to be separated from the wheat, as it were.
And it was never usually the thing of like, I mean, certainly by the end, it was not usually like, oh, that one sucked and we're not going to release that one. Usually the choice of what to release was about people's enthusiasm for the episode. So either right after we recorded it, we'd be like, that was really fun, and that we were cooking. Let's, like, somebody's going to edit that. Or it would be like, Eric, one of our editors, this was like his pet project. He just loved this one. He got really into it, and he's going to edit it. And it kind of was based on people enjoying it versus people thinking something else was bad. Which was, I think, that labor of love aspect was so fun.
Yeah. And I think that there were often episodes too where, like, it's funny because, like, it falls everywhere in between. So you have the stuff that, like, Nick was talking about. I'm pointing to Nick on the screen as if everybody has him down in the left quadrant. You have the here's the story. You have the stuff where you cut something out, but then what was equally interesting on the other end of the spectrum was the stuff that was, like, just on the cusp, and you're like, man, you could keep this B story in if you had 2 lines here and here that said this or connected that, or this whole thing would hang together if we just re-record it where Chris remembers the right name of the person who he was trying to talk about. Like, the whole thing would be gold. It's just because there was, like, a brain fart at that moment. And just seeing how, like, surgical it got. And I think that, like, it was a new discovery, and it was really cool to sort of be an up close, a VIP viewer to that process, because I'm such a friggin' nerd about this stuff, and Chris and Nick are 2 of my closest friends, and we talk about this stuff all the time in our 20s, and so, like, to find a new way and a new toolkit to like reinvigorate things that we loved, in one way when we were in our 20s, like in our 30s, and keep finding new, like, ways to engage with it. It was really cool, and it was really cool, like, afterwards to be talking about, like, wait, did you do that? Since we're talking about editing, I have to bring up one of my favorite things of all time, which involves Julia Weiss. As far as I know, I think it was Chris edited the episode. Now I'm blanking on the name of it, but it was the one with the sponsored content one. Nick, which one am I talking about?
Oh yeah. Gosh, I don't remember the name of it either.
But where it was revealed that Julia was playing, like, an alien character, and it was revealed in the improv that she was actually sentient sponsored content, and she immediately for Mike's Hard Lemonade of all goddamn things. And so she, like, as soon as Sean, I believe, I've listened to this several times, Sean Kelley was like, oh no, she's sponsored content, and, like, in the edited podcast, Julia immediately says, when you make your Gria with Mike's Hard, you kick it up a notch. And it was so funny.
The exact line is, when you freeze Mike's Hard, you kick your Gria up a notch.
That's it. And it was so fast and so funny that I was like, that is so hilarious. And Chris always points out that is the only time he had to add space in between the setup and the punchline, because Julia Weiss's brain was too fast.
Faster than the mind could.
They actually had to add space,
That's so cool.
add air in, compared to
Yeah.
what it was in the room, because it was too fast. You didn't get the setup and punchline. And I just think that that's such a cool, like you have the whole spectrum from editing down to like, oh no, to really enjoy this, we got to give it a little more air than was there.
Yeah.
Get some
I just think
room.
that's cool. Yeah.
That's wild. I have to get through one question that was asked by somebody else
Yes.
before I completely abandon this because we are running out of time. Batsu is up at 6:45. But we have a question of, when you're doing genre-specific improv, does it require different preparation, different skills than just regular long form or short form or other styles of improv?
I'll go. I'm kind of like yes and no. I'd say it requires more of a different knowledge base. Maybe it's requiring you to call on references, but that I would hope that people in their regular improv are also pushing themselves like physically and vocally to be able to play in different worlds. And and the basic skills of like just yes and playfulness and just going with your scene partners and your buddies, like that. Improvised Star Trek would not be what it was if not for the like basic improv skills, regular improv skills of the group.
I would say, as a counter example, I got so obsessed early on with all the things I could be asked during improv related to Star Trek, related to past IST episodes, that it totally ruined my ability to enjoy what I was doing and be spontaneous. And so there are several episodes I guested on that are in that 2/3 and should never see the light of day, because I just wasn't enjoying myself, and so it wasn't funny. And so I think it's possible to get in your head about the genre aspect and forget about the improv aspect. But one thing that I want to do in thinking about genre improv is, because we've done some shows in the past, like with other genre probs, certainly, in the festival and things. And Improvised Jane Austen is another great example. And one of the things I love about them that I think they get so right is they know what the relationship archetypes are for their genre. And I think that so this is how men and women are. This is how people of high status and low status are in this world. And they would just slot into that. And that was the shorthand. And then they just played off of that. And whether they knew the proper names of things or whatever, it didn't matter, because you got what was the scene was about, and they knew who they were about, and they just played that. And similarly with IST, like some of my favorite guests, or our good friend Monique, guested early on. She knows nothing about Star Trek, and she came out as like a life coach, and everyone else just sort of swarmed around her, and it was one of the funniest episodes. And I think that like just simple things like, this is what a typical commander subordinate relationship is like, or this is what an ambassador in a new planet, like those sorts of things are probably the only important bits. And then but that's about how do you relate with the person in front of you. It's really easy to get all the other junk in your head, as I can attest to, and then not be able to do the improv part of the genre improv.
Yeah. I mean, my answer is kind of an echo of that, is that if anything, genre work, it gives you a lot of gifts in the sense of, the world that you're working in. And it gave us this great gift of this shared world, where if a Klingon shows up, we know what that is. If we were trying to do a non-Star Trek sci-fi show, well, we'd have to establish all that ourselves. We have a great shorthand and a language that we can draw on. So it gives you that gift, but then it also gives you what could be a hurdle, which is particularly plot work. Plot is kind of anathema to improv. But as soon as you're doing a genre-based show, we're doing Star Trek. Star Trek has plots. We should have a plot. Where is this going? And then you get in your head, or you're trying to kind of game out the plot, and that kills improv really quick. But what we found was that if you go back to the improv basics of what is the relationship between these characters, which you can get from the genre itself, and how does that drive, and how does that drive the interaction, then you're playing your character's wants. What do I want in this scene? And as long as you're always driving toward that, then the plot takes care of itself. So that's the biggest kind of pitfall, but also gift that genre work, I think, gives us as improvisers.
Yeah.
The one thing,
Awesome. Guys, I've taken so many notes on everything you've said today.
There's one thing that I wanted to add specifically about the tech stuff and the live tech, was that it was cool. What was so great about doing Star Trek, and what it sprung fully formed into my mind as what was missing the first time I saw an IST show, was the soundscape of a Star Trek, of a TNG episode, is so integral to, to my memories of it, and seeing what was most of the world being conjured through improv and not having those sounds. That was what launched me on my, Sisyphean quest to create, the live show stuff that I did. But what was really fun from that bank was I had like 7, and no more than 7 core underscores that I used that actually kind of worked for everything. I thought early on, I got to get more, but they kind of worked for anything. And it was basically just about goosing what I was seeing. And there was one time pretty early on that I remember seeing a scene between Matt and somebody else who was like guesting that week. And they were kind of like a little bit at odds, but they weren't really committing to it. And you could tell they were sort of floundering. And I just hit the button for the dun, 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 dun. And I saw Matt just sort of straighten up and kind of square off a little bit. And then suddenly the scene had juice and stakes. And I was like, oh man. And same thing with that like gentle bloom, 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 bloom. Like that just reinforced, that sort of genre vocabulary just reinforced like, hey, you kind of got to play this a little bit bigger to land in the place that the genre wants. But it also helped, it seemed to help people like get into the world on stage as well as off stage.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Guys, I wish I could interview you for 2 more hours. I didn't get through half my questions. I got through less than a third. I sincerely hope we have the chance to do this again. I feel like I have so much more to ask and so much more to learn. I'm so grateful that you guys could be here for GENRETHON. We do unfortunately have to end. We have Batsu coming up in 2 minutes. Yeah. But thank you guys so much for being with us tonight. Everybody at home, you'll be able to see one of those Improvised Star Trek episodes that never made it out of the can.
One of the crappy ones.
It's actually really good. I listened to it and I had a really good time. I think you are overestimating. But I'm so appreciative for you guys. I'm going to end the live stream now. Feel free to wave to the fans.